Hello, this is Dr. Priyadip Das, Research Associate Professor from Department of Chemistry, SRM Institute of Science and Technology. Today we are going to discuss about the cleavage of carbonyl compounds. So cleavage of carbonyl compound is a very interesting reaction in organic chemistry. In presence of light, the carbonyl compound can break to produce usually alkyl radical and acyl radical, and also we have seen that aromatic ketone is also produce the benzyl radical and acetyl radical, and they take part in several rearrangement reaction to produce variety of products. Usually saturated ketone exhibit four main bands in their UV visible absorption spectrum. These bands are centered at usually 280 nanometer, 195 nanometer, 170 nanometer and 155 nanometer. The most important band is that at 280 nanometer for the photochemistry of carbonyl compound. And these bands corresponds to the N2 pi asterix transition. The photochemical reactions of carbonyl compound is initiated by this N2 pi asterix transition. The promotion of an electron will lead to either a singlet state or a triplet state. The photochemical reactions given by the carbonyl group take place either by singlet state or by triplet state or by both the state. So according to the Casas rule, we can say that only the lowest excited state will be involved in the primary photochemical or photophysical process of the organic molecule, usually in solution phase. The carbonyl compound given four type of reaction. So this reaction include alpha cleavage is the number one, number two is the beta cleavage, number three is the intramolecular and intermolecular hydrogen abstraction by carbonyl oxygen, and number four, the addition of carbonyl oxygen atom to a carbon-carbon multiple bond to produce a four-member cyclic attack. And these many cases, the four processes are competitive, and the major process followed is the sensitive of structural variation in the ketone and the choice of the used solvent. So now we are going to discuss the first one, the alpha cleavage or Norrish Type I process. So this Norrish Type I process is usually given by three types of ketones. First one is the saturated acyclic ketone, number two is the saturated cyclic ketone, and number three is the beta gamma unsaturated ketone. So Norrish Type I process, at first we will discuss the Norrish Type I process for the acyclic saturated ketones. So for the Norrish Type I process in the acyclic saturated ketone, the first process is the primary process. And what happened in the primary process? In this primary process is usually characterized by the initial cleavage of the carbonyl carbon and alpha carbon bond to give an acyl as well as one alkyl radical. And this process is usually known as the primary photochemical process as shown in the scheme 1. This is the carbonyl compound and its break happening. This is the alpha bond attached with the C double bond 2 and the CH2 produce the acyl radical and the alkyl radical. The initially formed acyl radical is stabilized by one of the secondary process. We will discuss the secondary process one by one as shown in the scheme 2. Similarly, the alkyl radical can also be stabilized by recombination or disproportionation. Now, we are here mentioning that A to C, that is the stabilization process of the acyl radical in the secondary process. The first one, that is the decarbonylation of the acyl radical to give the carbon monoxide and the alkyl radical. And this alkyl radical can recombine to give an alkane or can undergo intermolecular hydrogen abstraction to form an alkane and an alkene. You saw this acyl radical is produce alkyl radical and carbon monoxide. This RCH2 alkyl radical again combine with another RCH2 radical to produce the alkane. And this RCH2 radical with the first one, the alkyl radical produced in the primary process abstract a hydrogen from that produced the alkene and an alkane. Now in the second process, that is the number B, intermolecular hydrogen abstraction by the acyl radical form an alkyl radical to give an aldehyde and alkene, as shown in the figure scheme 2b. Here we see that RCH2C double bond O, the acyl radical react with the alkyl radical RCH dot CH2 R dash. This acyl radical can abstract a hydrogen from the beta position and produced an aldehyde and alkene. So here this is basically the intermolecular hydrogen abstraction from this alkyl radical by this acyl radical, and this process can only be possible if the alkyl radical have an beta hydrogen. Now this number C is the intermolecular hydrogen abstraction by the alkyl radical from the alpha carbon of the acyl radical to form a ketene and an alkene. You see here that the RCH2C double bond O, this acyl radical, react with this alkyl radical, and this alkyl radical, it can abstract a hydrogen from this acyl radical, and it will produce the ketene and alkene. The main process of the saturated acyclic ketone is the decarbonylation. So here in the third process, we are getting a ketene and alkane, but here the hydrogen abstracted from the acyl radical towards the alkyl radical. So in the Norrish type I reaction, there is a preference for the formation of most stable alkyl radical in case of unsymmetrical ketone. Let's see the example. Here the two alkyl group, that is a asymmetrical ketone, and the right side is a primary alkyl group and the left side is usually a tertiary alkyl group. Now the breaking of the alpha bond produced a tertiary radical and an primary acyl radical. But tertiary alkyl radical is quite stable. But if the breaking of this alpha dashed bond, then it will produce a tertiary acyl radical and a primary radical, which is the primary radical is not stable. That's why is always give the preference for the cleavage of the alpha bond to produce the most stable radical. In the above case, only the alpha bond will undergo cleavage, because if we consider the stability of both the radical, then the tertiary radical is more stable. Now, if both the alkyl substituent are same, then there is a little selectivity of bond cleavage. Now here you can see the example of CH3, CH2, CH2, C double bond O, CH2, CH3. One is the propyl radical and one was the ethyl radical that will be produced. So, now let us consider this example. So there is a problem, and it's mentioned that complete the following Norrish type I reaction. Basically, if we consider the problem, first we see this is a symmetrical ketone. Now this symmetrical ketone, if it's produced, it will produce the identical phenyl substituted alkyl radical. So in the primary process we produce, this is the acyl radical, that's C6H5 CH double bond O. This is the acyl radical, and C6H5 whole 2 CH dot, this is the alkyl radical. In the secondary process we consider the decarbonylation, and it is produced C6H5 whole 2 CH dot, this is the alkyl radical, and carbon monoxide release. Then these two alkyl radical is recombination and giving this following product with a 100% yield. Now we are going to discuss about the Norrish type I reaction of saturated cyclic ketone. So usually in cyclic ketone, in contrast to the acyclic ketone, show a greater tendency to undergo a alpha cleavage to produce acyl alkyl biradicals. The Norrish type I cleavage for the acyclic ketone takes place by sunlight as well as by the triplet excited state. So in cyclic ketones, the reaction takes place exclusively by the triplet state only. And it is possible, however, that intersystem crossing in the cyclic ketone is so rapid that the reaction from the singlet state would not be observed. And the triplet state is at least 100 times more reactive than the excited singlet state. So this Norrish type I process involves in the initial cleavage of the carbonyl carbon alpha carbon bond. That's similar to that of the acyclic ketone. And similarly, the subsequent secondary process A to C will happen and corresponds to those observed for the acyclic ketone. The similar reaction will happen here. Now we consider the first step, where we can see the decarbonylation of the acyl alkyl diradical to give the carbon monoxide and dialkyl radical. And the dialkyl radical can recombine to give a cycloalkane, or it undergoes intermolecular hydrogen abstraction to form an alkene as shown in the schemes 4a. Here we can see this is the cyclic ketone, and this cyclic ketone under presence of light going to the singlet excited state. Then intersystem crossing happen, it comes to the excited triplet state, where this carbonyl carbon alpha bond cleavage takes place to produce this acyl alkyl biradical. And this acyl alkyl biradical undergo decarbonylation reaction to produce this alkyl radical. This alkyl radical undergo either recombination to produce the cycloalkane, or either it will be intramolecular hydrogen abstraction to produce this alkene in this side, and here it is converted to CH3. The second process is the intramolecular hydrogen abstraction by the acyl radical from the beta carbon of the alkyl radical to give an unsaturated aldehyde molecule as shown in the scheme B. So this is the acyl alkyl radical, and this is the alpha carbon and the beta carbon. So here this acyl radical can abstract the hydrogen from this beta carbon to produce the aldehyde, and it can produce an alkene. So this is a unsaturated aldehyde produced in the process B. Now we are considering the process C. This is the intramolecular beta hydrogen abstraction from the acyl radical by the alkyl radical to produce a ketene derivative as shown in the scheme C. So this is the acyl alkyl radical, and this is the alpha carbon and beta carbon. And now here this is the alpha carbon and this is the beta carbon, and this alkyl radical can abstract a hydrogen from this beta carbon to produce the alkane here, and this will produce a double bond. So finally we are getting a ketene molecule. The biradical of the cyclic ketone can undergo one of the two hydrogen transfer process as we shown in the previously B and C via a cyclic transition state in which a hydrogen atom is transferred to one radical to another radical. It usually transfers from either alkyl radical center to the acyl radical center, or acyl radical center to the alkyl radical center. And this atom adjustment to the other radical center produces the different product. One is the ketene and another is the unsaturated aldehyde. So this photolysis of the cyclic ketones in gas phase gives decarbonylation as well as intramolecular hydrogen abstraction. And this intramolecular hydrogen abstraction mainly leads the formation of unsaturated aldehyde as shown in the scheme 5. Here we see this is the cyclohexanone. In presence of light, it can produce this acyl alkyl radical. If this acyl alkyl radical undergo decarbonylation reaction, is produced this diradical plus carbon monoxide, and this diradical can undergo a recombination process to produce cyclopentane, and further it will go for a intramolecular hydrogen abstraction to produce this alkene. And again, if the intramolecular hydrogen abstraction happen between this beta position of this alkyl radical, then it will produce a unsaturated aldehyde that we shown in the previously, and that reaction can be predominant in gas phase. In solution phase, the biradical pair is not usually stabilized by decarbonylation. So in this case, the biradical is mainly stabilized by intramolecular hydrogen atom transfer, and this intramolecular hydrogen atoms transfer leads to the formation of either unsaturated aldehyde or a ketene or a both. Here we can see if the cyclohexanone in presence of light in the solution phase produces this acyl alkyl radical, it will not go for the carbon monoxide release. This step will not going to happen. Here only the the intramolecular hydrogen abstraction by the carbonyl carbon radical to produce this unsaturated aldehyde, and another one, the intramolecular hydrogen abstraction by the alkyl radical to produce the ketene molecule. So when the photolysis is carried out in the presence of polar protic solvent, then the main species is the ketene, and this ketene then undergo solvent addition. Then it gives the carboxylic acid in presence if we use water as a solvent, and if we use alcohol as a solvent, then we get ester derivative as a product. So you can see here, this was the cyclohexane in presence of a polar protic solvent of alcohol is produced this molecule. This is the acyl alkyl radical, and this acyl alkyl radical produce the ketene, and ketene react with the alcohol molecule to give the ester derivative. Now let us discuss a problem. This problem, this is a substituted cyclohexanol, and the reaction is going to happen in the gas phase as well as in the liquid phase. Then what will be the difference in the product? So the alpha bond that produces the more stable alkyl radical cleaves preferentially. So here if we see, usually this alpha bond will go into cleavage, not this one, because this bond, if cleavage is happening, this alpha bond, then the most stable alkyl radical is produced. So in the vapor phase we see, this is the alpha bond cleavage, produce this acyl alkyl radical, followed by the decarbonylation, the removal of carbon monoxide, produce this biradical, recombination happen, and we are getting the cyclopentane derivative, methyl substituted cyclopentane derivative, and also here the hydrogen abstraction happen, and we are getting the substituted alkene as one of the product, major product. So here the vapor phase, the photolysis give the decarbonization and intramolecular hydrogen abstraction, and in the liquid phase the main reaction is the intramolecular hydrogen abstraction, which leads to the formation of the unsaturated aldehyde that we see in the previous one. So both the cases the product are different. So now we are going to discuss about the beta cleavage reaction of the carbonyl compound. Some class of compound have relatively weak C alpha and C beta bonds, so which can undergo cleavage as a result of electronic excitation of this carbonyl group. Such as example, cyclopropyl ketone are ones of such class of molecule, and evidence for the interaction between the carbonyl and cyclopropyl groups. And this will provide a mechanism by which energy may be transferred from the carbonyl group to the bond which is broken, and that is found in the UV spectrum, supported by the UV spectrum. Now the mechanism of the reaction has been shown to involve the formation of a biradical intermediate, and photolysis of the example, we can see the photolysis of this acetyl cyclopropane, and here we can see the breaking of the C alpha C beta bond in presence of light produce this biradical, and here one radical is on the beta carbon, another radical is on the alpha carbon, and this photolysis of the acetyl cyclopropane leads to the cleavage of cyclopropane ring, and this is followed by the hydrogen shift. So we can see the 1,2 hydrogen shift, path A and path B. So if the hydrogen shift happen following the path A, it will produce this alpha beta unsaturated carbonyl compound. This is considered as the major one, and here we can get the minor product, but the path B, the 1,2 hydrogen shift is happening, and it will produce beta gamma unsaturated carbonyl compound. Now in a similar way, if we consider the bicyclo 4,1,0 heptane 2-on derivative, this will also undergo this cleavage reaction, and one of the cyclopropyl CC bond is going to be cleavage, and this will produce this biradical, where one radical center is on the cyclic system, another on the CH2 system, and this is the 1,3 diradical. Then this 1,3 diradical is also go for the 1,2 hydrogen shift produces this cyclopentanone derivative, methyl substituted cyclopentanone derivative. But in the part 2, if we follow, then the ring expansion is happening with the formation of unsaturated ketone. And in this case, the 1,2 hydrogen shift can happen either by path B to produce this cyclic 7-member ring, and also in path A, this is also produce the cyclic 7-member ring, but the position of the double bond is different. Here we can get the alpha beta unsaturated carbonyl compound, alpha beta unsaturated cyclic ketone. Now here we have seen the example of alpha beta epoxy ketone have also a relatively weak C alpha C beta bond, which can be cleaved in the excited state. And this epoxy ketone reacts by the way of beta cleavage and alkyl migration on photolysis. So mechanistically, this reaction arises from a singlet N2 piasteric state, and the result is often the fission of the CO bond. The migratory amplitude shown within this compound is the best explained via the involvement of biradical species formed by CO bond fission. And some examples are we can shown here. This is the derivative. This is the epoxy ketone. If you give the light, this is the oxy radical and another radical on the carbon atom is produced, followed by 1,2 methyl shift, and we can produce this diketone derivative as the final product.